Chapter 18: Managing Work Groups and Teams. The learning objectives for this chapter will include a description of the types of groups and teams within organizations, why people join groups and teams, and the stages of group and team development. We'll also look at the essential characteristics of groups and teams, and also interpersonal and intergroup conflicts that exist within organizations, right? We'll also have some discussions on how organizations can manage conflict. Types of groups and teams. Groups consists of two or more people that interact regularly to accomplish a mutual purpose or goal. And you find out that most of the work in organizations results from people working together, right? So it results from people working together in groups, teams, or in social units, right? And you find out that just like in Francis Marion University, you have the School of Business would be considered a group within Francis Marion University, right? The School of Education will be considered a group or a team, right? So also you can have subdivisions within the groups and you can consider them teams. That's basically what groups are all about. So organizations comprise of groups and teams. And one of such groups that you find within organizations is what you call the functional group. This is a permanent group that is created by the organization to accomplish a number of the purposes of the organization with, and such functional groups have an unspecified time horizon, meaning that these groups called functional groups are basically kind of permanent structures of the organization, right? And for every function or tasks or responsibilities that each of these groups are saddled with, they have some form of contribution or input towards the organizational goals or organizational achievement of the organizational purpose, right? So examples of a functional group will be kind of permanent departments within organizations like the HR department, like the finance department, like the administration department, like the IT department. That would be functional group. Like in Francis Marion University, a functional group would be like the School of Business, right? Even the Human Resource Department is a functional group also in Francis Marion University. Also, you find out that some other type of group you find within organizations would be the informal or interest groups. These are created by members of an organization for purposes that may or may not be relevant to the organization, right? So, informal or interest groups, basically, the goals of such informal or interest groups, right, may serve the purpose of the organization, or it may just be serving the members' purpose of or interests of the members of the organization that formed the group. And in Francis Marion University, an example of an informal or interest group will be the AAUP, what you call the American Association of University Professors, right? So it's kind of a group of faculty members within Francis Marion University that advance the interests of faculty members who are their members. And to some extent, the purpose or goals of the AAUP would invariably or inadvertently serve the interests of Francis Marion University. Further on the types of groups and teams, still on the groups you find within organizations, we'll still be looking at one group called the task group. This is a group created by the organization to accomplish a relatively narrow range of purposes within a stated or implied time horizon, right? So you find out that after the purpose or the goal for which the group was constituted, or for which this task group or committee, as the case may be, these task groups may be referred to as committees within organizations. So after whatever goal or purpose for which the task group or committee was constituted has been achieved, such task groups are disbanded. They are not permanent structures or permanent groups like the functional group or the departments within organizations. So these task groups may be considered committees, and they basically are constituted to achieve some narrow tasks. And you find out that members of task groups or members of the committee cut across the different departments of an organization. So you find out that each member from a different department is basically contributing their expertise based off what their department does. So it's like a collaboration between departments to achieve a purpose that kind of is the organizational purpose but requires the expertise of members or employees from different departments. Now, looking at team would be a group of workers that function as a unit, right? Often with little or no supervision. And basically, when you find teams within an organization, they carry out work related tasks, functions, and activities, right? So organizations create teams for a variety of reasons, and they may include to give more responsibility for task performance to the workers who are actually performing the tasks. They could also be for reasons like to empower workers by giving them greater authority or autonomy and decision making freedom. Also, why they may want to create teams within organization is to allow the organization to capitalize on the knowledge and motivation of their workers, as well as to enable the organization to shed its bureaucracy and promote flexibility and responsiveness. So the kind of bureaucracy that you may find within organization, within departments, or within interactions across departments. So given that the the job or the problem that is to be solved by this team will require the expertise of members of different departments, for instance, right? And if it were to be done by interdepartmental collaboration, there might be bottlenecks due to bureaucracy. Then it's easier to create teams that would include members from each of these departments. So it sheds the bureaucracy, sheds those bottlenecks, and allow for greater autonomy in decision making and for ease in coming up with outcomes also. So when an organization chooses to use teams, it is essentially implementing a major form of organization change. Thus, it is important to follow a logical and systematic approach to planning and implementing teams in an existing organization design. And it is important to recognize that there may be resistance from employees, right, when organizations decide to constitute team as a part of or as an approach to working within the organization. So after teams are formed, managers should continue to monitor their contributions and how effectively they are functioning within these organizations. The diagram on this slide is basically an illustration of all the types of groups within organizations that we discussed earlier on, right? So you can see here that the 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 figures or the images or the symbols or the shapes captured under the orange coloring are representative of the functional group. You can see that they all report to a top manager that is considered the vice president along that column that is in an orange shade. That tells you a department has its hierarchy, right? Different levels of different managerial levels up to the top manager that they report to. Now, on an informal group, which will like the AAUP in Francis Marion, it will comprise different faculty members from different groups of Francis Marion, different schools, different colleges, right? So you can see it embedded in the yellow background, right? So you can see it cuts across different groups. So you can see it cuts across this group, this functional group, also cuts across the other functional group that have different top managers that they report to, the vice presidents they report to. And also you can see the shade of green, which is for the cross-functional team or task groups. You can see that it comprises members from different departments across different departments, because those expertise or those members from different departments are required to contribute their expertise in solving problems in this team. So it cuts across members from all the departments of the organization for them to constitute a cross-functional team. Types of teams. we have the problem solving team, which is the most popular type of team you find within organizations, right? And it comprises knowledge workers who gather to solve a specific problem, and after which they get to disband. You can call these problem solving teams like committees, because it basically incorporates members of staff from different departments of an organization, or let's say members of faculty from different colleges or schools in Francis Marion University having to come together to solve a problem, or to have to advance an initiative that is of interest to all the members, or all their various departments, or Francis Marion University as an organization wholly, right? And you find out that once those expertise, those various expertise are brought to bear, and such problems are solved, or such initiatives are fully advanced or propagated, then the committee or the problem solving team gets disbanded, right? Also, we'll be looking at the management team, which consists mainly of managers from various functions like sales and production. And what these managers do is to coordinate work among other teams. So the management team would comprise, in Francis Marion, it comprise like the deans that head different schools and colleges. The vice presidents would equally be part of the management team, right? In Francis Marion University, even in different organizations, maybe in the industry, the head of departments would be part of the management team. An executive committee, which is like the top managers and the board members and the CEO, this would also form part of the management team of an organization, right? Then we'll be looking at what we call the work team. This is an increasingly popular type of team within organizations, right? Work teams are responsible for the daily work of the organization. When empowered, they are self-managed teams, right? So work teams may comprise departments within organizations, or schools or colleges within the university, like Francis Marion University. Those are work teams. Or maybe when you come to like the School of Business, for instance, right? And under the School of Business, you have like the accounting department. Under the School of Business, you have the finance, you have the management. Those also can actually constitute what you call work teams, right? Because they are responsible for the daily work of the organization. So let's say there are those faculty members that are in accounting are responsible for passing on knowledge in the accounting field daily in Francis Marion University. So all those members of faculty that are in accounting may also be considered a work team, an accounting work team as well in the School of Business, for instance. Going further on types of teams within organizations, you have what you call the virtual team. This is a newer type of work team where members interact on a virtual platform or in a virtual arena, right? Members enter and leave the network as needed, and may take turns serving as the leaders of the group or the work or the virtual team where they meet. The team comprises people from remote work sites who work together online, basically. Also, we have other types of team, what you call the quality circle, right? And basically quality circles are declining in popularity, right? And these quality circles comprise workers and supervisors that meet intermittently to discuss work problems, right? Such an example of quality circle would be the meetings that hold within departments, right? Whereby members of the department or the different arms of the department come together to discuss what are the matters that are arising within the department that needs to be addressed, right? So you find out that the meetings within a department would be an example of quality circle, where they have to discuss matters arising, and as well as how they can improve their processes or workings on the job. Why do people join groups and teams? One would be because of interpersonal attraction, right? When people are attracted to one another, they have similar attitudes and have similar personalities or shared life experiences. You find out that most often than not, they tend to be aligned to the same group or the same team. They tend to have the same kind of platform for which their shared experiences are a basis for their coming together or their common ground, right? Now you have the group activities could also be a reason why people join the group. So the group activities appeal to such people who join such groups, right? And some of such activities will be like when you have the book groups that the book clubs, right, that have to go do a lot of reading. So such activities may appeal to people who are more inclined to reading or people who want to develop the knack for reading. They are more likely to join a book club, right, because of the activities, right, or interest groups too. Let's say the AAUP, to the extent that the AAUP actually protects or advances the interest of faculty members who are their members. You find out that such activities that they actually advance within Francis Marion University would be a basis for faculty members to actually join them, because in the event such faculty member would require their support in the line of their career or along their career path within Francis Marion University, they could actually come to their aid. Now, group goals also would be the reason why people join groups, right? What the purpose of the group is. So the group goals actually motivate such people to join them in the first place. An example of some group goals that have, or goals that some groups have that actually influence people or attract people to joining them would be like the Save the Whales group, right? Or groups that actually come together to actually check global warming. Such goals or purposes actually attract members as well. People also join groups or teams for need satisfaction, right? Whereby joining the group or team fulfills the individual's need for affiliation. An example of that would be people who join support groups, right? So support groups or people who are new to a community, you find out that they tend to maybe join the churches, groups within churches, so that they can actually get themselves familiarized with their new environment, right? That would be joining such groups like a church group for need satisfaction, so that they are kind of they can settle in easily in their new environment. Now, people could also join groups for their instrumental benefits, right? Where membership of such groups provides other benefits. So, an example of that would be professional networking groups or local civic groups. Like a professional networking group like the Shrimp, for instance, right? The benefit of Shrimp would be such that people who are members of the Shrimp have some form of recognition, especially when they are seeking employment. So when someone who has a Shrimp certification is seeking employment, be it in the industry or academia, especially if they are seeking employment in the area of human resource management, that would actually be helpful, that would be beneficial to such applicants because of their membership of Shrimp or membership in that group called Shrimp. This diagram on this slide basically illustrates the stages of group and team development, and you find out that the first stage of group or team development starts with the forming stage, right? And you go to the storming stage, then the norming stage, then you get to the last stage, which is the performing stage, right? And you find out that at the forming stage, basically group members begin to test the limits of acceptable behavior. Usually, if it was an in class if this was an in class course, if this course was in class, usually what I do on my first day of classes would be this introduction we did on Blackboard. We'll do it in person, right? Having people try to understand what the boundaries or personalities of their colleagues are. This will be some form of the forming stage where people are getting together for the first time, right? That would be a forming stage. So the storming stage would be like a stage whereby members of this group, having gone through the forming stage, they show an initial lack of unity and an uneven interaction pattern, right? So some members may begin to exert themselves to become recognized as the group leader. Such things or such chaos or such disagreements tend to occur at the storming stage. Now, the norming stage is a stage whereby the group members recognize and accept their roles in the group, and they tend to start developing a sense of unity even at the norming stage. Performing stage is whereby the members enact the roles and basically direct their effort towards attaining the goals of the group and performing sustainably or performing at a very high level, right? Or having quality performance or very positive outcomes. This is basically the discussion or information on those stages of group and team development. For the forming stage, this is where there's an attempt to define the task and how it will be accomplished through discussions of task related concepts or issues, right? First day as a team, members of this team they try to figure out what the goals are of the group's goals, right, and the parameters of the assignment. So for instance, if you were to work in a group, right, in this class, the first day of your group meeting or the first day as a group, you would have such focus, which is to figure out what you intend to achieve as a group, right, your goals, and what are the parameters for whatever you have been assigned, right? Now, the storming stage would be a stage whereby there's some form of defensiveness from the group members, intra-group competition, and the formation of factions within the group, right? There will be some arguments among the members even when they agree. Now, this group stage, this storming stage also entails brainstorming on how things would be accomplished by the group, right? Discussions among the members, also having to break down the group tasks into different little units so members can take on different elements of the task, which is division of labor. The norming stage is basically a stage where members establish and maintain team ground rules, right? They tend to become more friendly among themselves and tend to host or share confidences among themselves. Now they begin to also work towards the goals of the group or the goals of the team. The performing stage, which is the final stage, is where the ability of the group come have come to the stage whereby they now have the capabilities to prevent or work through their problems. They have a strategy for addressing whatever problems that arise within the group, right? Members start to develop close attachment to the team, and there's always they also have kind of a defined mechanism for accomplishing the goals of the team, right? At this performing stage, there's some form of ease and disposition among members for conflict resolution due to their alignment with the overarching goals of the group or the team, their interest and high degree of familiarity that must have been fostered among the members, and also being that at this stage they must have also developed a structure for addressing whatever that challenges or issues they may face. Role structures. As groups and teams mature and pass through the four basic stages of development, they begin to take on four important characteristics, and those characteristics that these groups or teams actually adopt. The first would be a role structure. Then you have the second called the norms of the group. Then the third characteristic would be the cohesiveness, and the fourth characteristic would be informal leadership. Now, when we talk about role structure as one of the characteristics, we want to define what role is, and role would be seen as the part that individuals or individual members of the group play, or the functions that they undertake in helping the group reach its goals. And some roles that we'll be looking at would be the task specialist role, And this is basically a role that concentrates on, or whoever takes up this role concentrates on getting the group's tasks accomplished. And you have the social emotional role, and any member of the group who takes on this role provides social and emotional support to other members of the team. The development of a role. Role structures emerge as a result of role episodes. We find out that this episode or the process begins with the expected role. And this expected role is basically what other members of the team expect this individual member of the team to do, right? And from the expected role, it gets translated into the central. And the central is basically the messages and cues that team members use to communicate the expected role to the individual. And from the central, the next in the process, or the next stage in the episode, would be the perceived role, which is what the individual or that individual member of that team or group actually perceives their central to mean. And from the perceived role, we get on to the next, which is the enacted role. And this is exactly or actually what the individual member of the group does in that role. Further on the role structures, role ambiguity. This arises, or role ambiguity basically comes up when the central is unclear and the individual member of that group or team does not know what is expected of him or her. Basically, when there are unclear structures or there is some gap in information, right? And you find out that what managers could do, or managers in an organization could do to actually stem the occurrence of role ambiguity would be to have clear and reasonable expectations and sending clear and straightforward cues that can eliminate role ambiguity. So, in trying to assign tasks or actually give jobs to their subordinates, they should make sure that whatever expectations they have of their subordinates should be very clear, and whatever it is that are elements of the task that are being assigned to this subordinate, they should be very clear and straightforward, so there are no incidences of role ambiguity. Now, looking at role conflict, this basically occurs when the messages and cues comprising the central are clear, but they are contradictory or mutually exclusive, right? So an example of role conflict would be when a subordinate is told to finish the assignment but by Friday, but no overtime is allowed, meaning that the expectation, right, is that the assignment should be done by Friday. And for the assignment to be done by Friday, it is possible that this may actually require some overtime. So asking the same employee or the same member of the team or group not to actually get into overtime would be negating the first assignment, which is to ensure that the task is completed by Friday. Because in the event that the task requires some overtime to be completed, this employee would be hamstringed to get it completed, since they're expected not to go into overtime. So managers, in order to avoid occurrence of role conflict, may want to have consistent expectations of their employees, and these expectations to take into account the employees' other roles and personal value system, so that there is some minimization of role conflict. Then we'll be looking at overload. This occurs when the expectations for the role exceed the individual's capabilities to perform. So basically, the employee or the member of the team or group that is being assigned a task in their particular role, or is being assigned a function which is linked to their role, do not have maybe the knowledge, the skills, or maybe the behaviors that are expected to get the task carried out effectively, right? So role overload is basically looking at occurrences or incidences where there's some form of gap in the capabilities of the member of the group that is assigned the role, right? So, and for managers, so an example of that would be when an employee has several tasks that are urgent, right? So this employee, if they have several tasks that are urgent and they lack the time management skills, right? Or they lack the skills for prioritizing which ones are urgent, getting the ones that are urgent done faster than the ones that aren't urgent, having to prioritize. If they lack those skills, they may get overwhelmed, right? And for managers to actually stem the rise of role overload or the occurrence of role overload, they may want to recognize the individual member of the group's capabilities and their limits, right? They want to know what skills. So in this situation where the employee is given several tasks, they want to know how well the employee is able to manage their time in order to effectively handle all those tasks that have been assigned, how well the employee is able to work under pressure given the enormous number of tasks that they are being given, or how well the employee is able to navigate through all the tasks, having all the skills that are relevant to be able to navigate smoothly through the number of tasks that they've been assigned. These are the kind of information such a manager of such employees should arm themselves with in order to avoid role overload. Further on the role structures, role conflict. Interrole conflict occurs basically when a person has two roles that are in conflict with each other, right? And example of a role conflict would be a working parent that is torn between the professional and parent lives, right? Often struggling between meeting maybe a work deadline and committing to the parent role. And committing to the parent role may come in forms of like attending to their children or attending a child's school event, right? So having to attend a child's school event that is probably occurring at the same time like their work time, right? Having to juggle between those two would be an example of interrole conflict, right? Because they have their roles as professionals in the workplace and they have the roles as parents that have to attend to the needs of their children. Looking at intra-role conflict, this occurs when a person gets conflicting information about one role that he or she enacts, right? Example of that would be in a situation whereby two managers or superiors are actually requesting an employee to do their tasks. So an example of that would be deliver a report and make a presentation. And both cannot be accomplished at the same time. So this would kind of cause for intra-role conflict, right? Where the two line managers or two superiors that this employee actually report to are assigning them conflicting tasks or different tasks that cannot be achieved at the same time. Now looking at intrasender conflict, this would arise when a single source sends contradictory messages, right? It could be clear, but the messages could be contradictory in their form, right? And an example would be having different expectations at different times or situations, right? So having same person that is assigning tasks, same manager that is assigning tasks, having different expectations for similar tasks that have been assigned, right? At different times, coming up with different goals, different expectations for similar tasks. That would be an example of intrasender conflict. Now, looking at person role conflict, this is basically a discrepancy between role requirements and the individual that is carrying out the tasks that are assigned or that are required of that role. The conflict or the gap between the requirement of the role and the personal values, attitudes, and needs of the individual that undertakes that role, right? So putting it in a concise form is a disjoint and non-alignment in the expectations or goals of the person that is undertaking that role and the role requirement itself. So job role example would be like job role in a situation whereby the job role requires working overtime when the employee is an advocate of work-life balance. So you can see that that's the person's value for work-life balance is not in tandem with the expectation of the job to actually work overtime. Behavioral norms. Norms are standards of behavior that a group accepts for and expects of its members, right? So a group or a team, the norm would be the behavioral expectations of members of that group, right? And the norms actually define boundaries. They actually highlight the boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable behavior within the group or team, right? Example of norms will be meetings start promptly and information will not be repeated for late arrivals, right? So it tells you basically that within this group that for every late comer in a meeting or in the group meeting would not have the privilege of gaining information that has already been discussed or that has already been deliberated on prior to their coming to the meeting, right? So looking at norms, there are elements of norm, and one of the elements will be what you call the norm generalization. And it's all about, the whole idea is that the norms of one group cannot always be generalized to another group. So for instance, here in Francis Marion University, in the School of Business, there's this norm we have, the standard of behavior we have, which is basically that faculty members are expected to have to leave their offices open, and the idea behind that is to encourage students and even their colleagues alike to walk in at any time and seek information from the faculty member, right? And as it were in the School of Business, in the same organization which is Francis Marion University, such norm may not be applicable to faculty members in the School of Education, or it may not be applicable to faculty members in the School of Health Sciences, right? So you find out that norms of a group may not be generalized within the organization. So different groups within an organization, different departments within an organization may have their varying norms, which doesn't have to be generalized, right? Meaning the norm of one group within an organization, example, the School of Business, may not be applicable or transferable to another group, like let's say the School of Education. Now looking at what norm variation, right? So it's saying, for instance, norm generalization. Let me give you another example too before we go into variation. Norm generalization is basically looking at elements of also whereby what is accepted or acceptable in one group may be found on in another group, right? So let's say in the American environment, right, the norm is that you should actually refer to people by their first names, your superiors by their first name. And that is, let's say the group is a big group, which is like a nation, for instance, on a wider scale, which is the nation, the group of Americans, right? Nationals, group of American nationals. Let's say that American national, when such norm is transferred to an environment or a group like a group of Nigerian nationals, whereby the culture or the values or the acceptable behavior among Nigerian nationals is that superiors should not be addressed by their first name. You will find out that such norm among human beings which belong to different groups, which is the American nationals groups and the Nigerian national groups, such norms which is address people by first name cannot be transferred to the Nigerian national group. That's just about norm generalization also. Now norm variation basically says that norms and the application vary within a group or team too. The application of the norms too may vary. So norm variation may be allowed within a group as long as it is not taken to an extreme. An example of this may be flexibility in laws or regulations, right? You find out that such flexibility is to allow for differences in groups or variations in situations, right? That's why there are such flexibilities in maybe laws or regulations. Still on the behavioral norms, norm conformity. This is basically looking at that individual members of a group can either adapt or either conform or comply with an existing norm, or they may ignore it, right? So in the event that they adapt to the norm, that would be an exhibition of norm conformity or an expression of norm conformity, right? So those who conform to the norms of the group will definitely be welcome to the group, whereas those who ignore the norms of the group, in most cases, or most often than not, may be ostracized from the group, right? So there are certain factors that actually influence non-conformity within groups or teams, right? The first would be what you call the group factors. Group factors will relate to when there is pressure or when there are pressures from the group members compelling members of the group to actually conform to the norms, right? So you find out that pressure from group members actually compel the group behavior. Now, another factor that impacts non-conformity would be the initial stimulus that affects behavior or that prompts the group behavior, right? So you find out that when that stimulus or the stimuli is more ambiguous, right, there is more pressure to conform. When it is unclear what is prompting the group behavior, right, you find out that the more unclear it is, the more the likelihood that members would conform. Now, the individual traits of the members of the group would equally affect their propensity to conform, right? So you find out that the measure of intelligence of the group member or the team member would actually affect how well or to the extent to which they conform, because it's assumed or it's believed that intelligence affects propensity to conform, whereby people that are seen as more intelligent people that are often less susceptible to pressure are most likely less susceptible to pressure to conform. I'll go over that again. Whereby people who are seen as to be very intelligent, right? Those people are less susceptible to the pressure to conform. So those group factors that actually relate to the pressure from group members that compel group behavior, right? It is believed that very intelligent people who may be members of that group may be less susceptible to such pressures from the group members to conform, given their measure of intelligence, right? Now, the last factor that influences non-conformity would be what we call the situational factors, right? And that may have to be related to the team size and consensus, right? The level of agreement that exists within the group, right? Or maybe as members of the group or as an individual member of the group learns about the norms the more, then having knowledge on or having information on what is the basis for that norm, having more information on what that norm seeks to achieve as a behavior, such information would actually impact the likelihood to conform more among members of that group or team. Further on behavioral norms, conformity to group norms, right? So you find out that given on conformity, there are elements of it. The first will be individual responses. So that would be individual members of the group, like adopting norms of the group, right? Trying to obey the spirit of the norms while retaining their individuality, meaning that in as much as they are conforming of the norms, they don't try to lose their personalities. They don't tend Their conformance to the norms of the group does not drive their their inclination towards groupthink. They are more of maintaining their position, their individuality in the face of conforming to the norms of the group, right? Now, the other element of conformity to group norms will be socialization. This is basically that about generalized non-conformity that occurs when a person makes the transition from being an outsider to being an insider of an organization or an insider of the group, right? Within an organization, you find out that socialization actually allows for the person to be more conforming of the norms, whereby they are more familiarized with both members of the group and also the norms of the group. Such socialization actually makes them makes them better part of the group, right? Because at that point they get to be more familiarized with not just what the group is all about, but actually with members of the group. That compels conformity as well. Looking at the other characteristic that arises during group or team development, we're looking at the cohesiveness characteristic, right? Cohesiveness basically is the extent to which members of a group are loyal and committed to that group, the degree of mutual attractiveness that exists within that group, right? It's all about the alignment within the group, the sense of unity within the group, right? Factors that can increase the level of cohesiveness within a group or team may include what you call the intergroup competition, personal attraction to the group maybe, or favorable evaluation of the group by outsiders, right? Agreement on goals by group members and frequent interaction between members. Those are things or factors that foster cohesiveness, right? Whereas there are other factors too that may equally reduce cohesiveness within teams or groups, and such factors may include the size of the group or team, whereby large group sizes would actually impede team cohesiveness, right? When there are disagreements on group goals, that would impede cohesiveness as well. Or when there's intra-group competition, not inter-group competition this time around, or when there's some form of domination by one or more persons within the group, right? Or unpleasant experiences that emanate from the group membership, then those factors basically would impede cohesiveness. Now, what are the consequences of cohesiveness? Basically, you find out that with cohesiveness, right, when teams become more cohesive, rather, their members interact more frequently, right? And there's the likelihood that members of that group or team would be more conforming to their norms when there is a high level of cohesiveness, and they become more satisfied with the team too, right? So when group cohesiveness and performance norms interact, right, when there's cohesiveness and there's conformance to the norms of the group, there is the high likelihood that there will be very positive outcomes or very laudable performance of the group goals, right? The group goals will be achieved or attained in a very successful manner, right? It will be quite successful in the achievement of the group. They will be quite successful in the achievement of the group goals, right? From a manager's perspective, for instance, high cohesiveness, when you combine that with high performance norms, right, that would be the best situation, whereby the group is well aligned, the group is well unified, right, and the norms within the group are such, or those standards of behavior that are expected within the group are such that they propel or that they drive quality performance, right? So you find out that those are the situations a manager would basically want to achieve, whereby there would be high cohesiveness within their group as well as high performance norms. The table on this slide is basically reminding us of the various types of teams we discussed earlier on in one of those chapters earlier on. That's basically what it highlights here. Cohesiveness and performance norms. If we look at this diagram, this grid on this slide, you find out that it's basically a grid that has the performance norms on the y-axis and the cohesiveness, level of cohesiveness within the group on the x-axis, whereby it's a spectrum, right? From moving from the left for the cohesiveness, the left of the x-axis would be from low to high, left to right would be from low to high, and for the y-axis that the performance norms are represented from from bottom to top will be from the low to high. So you see interactions between these two characteristics is basically what forms the boxes within the grid, right? So you may just want to look, let's say where there is low performance norms and there is low cohesiveness within the group. Where there are low performance norms, the group has low performance norms and there's low cohesiveness, you find out there is low performance, right? When the group has high performance norms but low cohesiveness, there's moderate performance. When the group has high cohesiveness and low performance norm, that is the lowest performance, because they have very low standards of behavior that can compel quality performance of the group, and the group is basically united for the wrong reasons, maybe because high cohesiveness means there is some form of alignment, some form of unity. But if what they are aligning, what if the alignment or the unity among the group members isn't such that their standard of behavior is such that would compel the performance of the group or the achievement of the goals of the group, then that means they are aligned or they are unified for the wrong reasons, and that's why there will be the lowest performance. Because if the norms aren't such that they will drive performance, then the unity isn't going to be very effective. It will be counter effective to the highest, right, or to the limit. That's why that's the lowest performance that would be the outcomes, right? But when there's high cohesiveness and there are high performance norms, the group will achieve the high performance or the highest level of performance. So performance norms basically are overarching factors that affect a group or team's performance, right? So when there are, in the event that there is low cohesion, right, and high performance norm, members of the team may be seen to be working in silos or be individualistic, right? So high performance norm means they are motivated to perform highly, but there is lack of unity. So some form of silo working will exist in such group or such organization, right? Formal and informal leadership. Informal leader is a person who engages in leadership activities but whose right to do so has not been formally recognized by the organization or the group they belong to, right? So, an informal leader also, and I mean, by this definition, an informal leader will be someone who is in acting capacity, maybe, right? So, an informal leader too may also be the formal leader for the group or may supplement the formal leader in fulfilling leadership roles. And they draw on referent or expert power as leaders. You find out that such informal leaders in the group, they command or gain the respect of other members of the group. They gain the trust and admiration of other members of the group that may be considered their followers, right? And these informal leaders exude some form of confidence and they possess some form of expertise in their field that help the team members, right? So this makes the team members, this actually stimulates the trust of other team members in this informal leader, believing that this informal leader can actually make decisions or actually offer advice and guidance that would be in the best interest of that group or the organization, right? Now, a formal leader would be a person who is elected or designated to engage in leadership activities by the group members, right? So they are formally appointed or recognized by the organization to lead that group or to be the leaders of that group, right? So the informal and the formal leader in any group or team may actually be the same person or they may be different people as well. The nature of conflict. Conflict, this is a disagreement among two or more individuals, groups, or organizations. Conflict is inevitable. It's an inevitable element of interpersonal relationships that you find within organizations because members of organization have to work together to actually achieve the goals of the organization, right? And you find out that recently experts have realized that although conflict can be a major problem, right? Certain kinds of conflict may be beneficial, may also be beneficial. So while generally the conflict is viewed as something to be avoided, it can also be beneficial, right? Because you find out that such conflicts, when it's beneficial, it may promote research within the group or within the organization. It will promote study, will promote analysis, and it will equally further discussions when there's some form of conflict on if there are areas of disagreement, right? It can equally prompt for further discussions if that may be the case. So either too much or too little conflict can be dysfunctional for an organization. So that means that in either case, whether conflict is too much or when the conflict is too little, then you find out that performance may be low within the organization, right? So it's advised or it's expected, or the advice is that whenever conflict is to be beneficial, it should be a moderate level of conflict, right? Because a moderate level of conflict within a group or among members of an organization will spark or may be able to spark motivation among the group members. So such motivation is what actually allows for research, motivation to conduct further study, or motivation to run some analysis, or motivation to further the discussions, right? Such moderate levels of conflict spark creativity, innovation, and initiative, and equally raises the level of performance, unlike when there is too much conflict or too little conflict. The nature of organizational conflict. This graphical representation here on this slide is basically illustrating that when conflict is too low, if you look at the x-axis, right, where the line is drawn from too low to the left, that would equal performance level that is too low within the organization, right? So where it marks up on the y-axis, which is the performance axis, right? When it's too low conflict, it marks off at 0, which is low performance. And when it goes to the other extreme, which is too high a conflict, it still marks off at low performance, which is 0 performance. But the mid level, which is moderate level of conflict, actually allows for an optimal performance, or optimal level of conflict allows for such improved performance within an organization or a group. The causes of conflict. Interpersonal conflict. This is a conflict that occurs among two or more individuals, and this conflict is caused by a personality clash, right? It could be from personality clash when two people distrust each other's motives, right? Or they dislike each other, or for some other reason they cannot get along with each other, right? That would be interpersonal conflict based off the personality clash, right? And it could be based off differences in their beliefs or perceptions, or when there's some form of excessive competition among the individuals that are having this interpersonal conflict, right? Or when the competition is the basis for their interpersonal conflict, rather. Now we have the intergroup conflict, right? When there's conflict between two or more groups within an organization. Within the same organization, it could be conflict between the two departments, right? And it could be based off reasons like interdependence, because one department's output may be one department's input, or vice versa, and that somehow that relationship causes for conflict, right? In the nurturing, or in the in the establishment or in the process of that relationship, there may be some form of intergroup conflict, because those departments are interdependent, or those business units are interdependent given their work relationships, right? Or when different groups have different goals, right? It can actually cause for intergroup conflicts. Or when there is some form of competition for scarce resources, let's say within an organization, different departments or different groups or different teams or different business units actually trying to get the best of the financial resources of the organization when they are actually budgeting during the budgeting process, right? So there may be competition for such scarce organization financial resources within an organization, and that can cause for intergroup conflict or conflict between departments of an organization, right? The other arm would be conflict between an organization and the environment, and the organization's environment, right? So you find out that this can be conflict between one organization and another organization in its environment, and in that situation it will be called inter-organizational conflict. Or conflict between an organization and its environment may be resultant from competition or disagreements between the two organizations, right? And it may also arise between an organization and other elements of its environment, such as, let's say, consumers, right? Or consumer groups, governmental agencies, right? Or even their internal environment, their employees, right? And when there's a conflict between an organization and members of its internal environment, let's say the employees, such conflicts can lead to industrial action, right, which is some form of an outcome where you have unions. There might be some industrial actions or what you call strike, right? Or there may be conflict between the organization and their suppliers too, which is part of their task environment or task external environment. Stimulating conflict. We'll find out that conflict can have both negative and positive consequences, like we discussed earlier on, right? It's not entirely a negative outcomes don't entirely precipitate from conflict situations, right? It could be positive outcomes, like there's creativity from competition, right? Or when there's some form of innovation, right, based off competition, or motivation is increased because there's some form of conflict, or when there are members of the group trying to attain one position, right, and they're all going for one position. Such competition may actually motivate every other person to actually work harder, right? So it could be a good thing, right? And you find out that managers may find it necessary to, for the reasons that conflict may have positive consequences, managers may deem it necessary to stimulate a certain degree of conflict, right, if groups are not motivated or if a change is needed, right? So because such conflict may stimulate motivation or may stimulate creativity when things status quo remains the same, or when employees are not well motivated. Managers may actually bring rise or give rise to conflict situations within the group or organization, and they can achieve this by increasing competition among the individual members and of the group and the teams, right? And what that does is, like, they can do that by offering differential rewards, and this can lead to conflict. Those that are fair and equitable are constructive, right? So let's say, for instance, competition would be, for instance, for a particular job outcome there should be a reward, right? That would actually get members of the group motivated, giving the reward for performance or the reward for achieving that job outcome. Or let's say, for instance, if the case of the competing situation is a case whereby it's a vacant position, whereby members of the group, there are 5 members of the group, for instance, who want to attain only one vacant position, right? And the reward is promotion, which is vertical job loading. The reward for attaining that position is vertical job loading. So having just one vacant position for 5 eligible members of that group would be increasing competition, because ordinarily reducing competition will be having 5 vacant positions for 5 eligible members of the group. So you can see that it can spark some form of motivation, right, when there's a reward for achieving a particular job outcome or attaining a particular performance level, whereby in this situation the reward is promotion if someone is the best out of the competing situation, right? Another way managers can actually stimulate for conflict would be to bring in one or more outsiders from outside the organization, right? Bring in outsiders from outside the organization into the organization for them to shake things up and present a new perspective on the organizational practices. So you find out that this is usually the case when the organization seeks or is involved in a change management process, right? Sometimes a change management process may not require having to carry along older employees. It may actually entail infusing new employees into the organization in order to actually cause for such changes that are intended to exist within the organization, right? Another way managers may want to stimulate conflict will be to change established or existing procedures within an organization, right? Changing the status quo, because employees, members of an organization, what they are used to, they don't want to differ from it along major lines, right? So when managers actually are changing established procedures, that may cause resentment and actually lead to exiting of employees or turnover among employees. Now, how can conflict be managed, right, within an organization? How can managers stem down the conflict situation or make sure that it is reduced? One way is to ensure that when conflict is stimulated, it's stimulated for constructive ends. Constructive ends meaning that it is stimulated to ensure that employees are motivated, for instance, or maybe stimulated to improve creativity, or maybe stimulated to ensure that employees have some form of innovation going on. I mean, it should be for constructive ends, right? Another way to manage conflict will be to control the conflict before it escalates, right? Another way to manage conflict will be to actually resolve the conflict. Controlling conflict. We'll find out that managers sometimes they want to control conflict to keep it from becoming excessive. That's like spiraling out of hand, right? And to control conflict, what these managers could do, the ways they could control conflict will include to expand the resource base. So, for instance, within an organization, if different departments are actually trying to avail themselves as much financial resources of the organization as possible, whereby there may be competition for the resources among the departments of the organization or groups or even individual members of the organization. Such organization or managers that handle such resource bases, or who are the ones that manage those resource bases, could actually, or those resources rather, could actually increase the resource bases, if that makes sense, right? So here in Francis Marion University, for instance, an example would be for professional development, right? There's a scarce resource for professional development, right? Which is for members of faculty or staff to improve themselves on their career, right? One way Francis Marion University actually controls for conflict with regards to utilization of its financial resources, maybe for professional development, is to have a cap. What I mean a cap is to have a limit, or rather a specified amount of funds, rather, which is capped, right, for every member of staff, for every member of faculty or staff for their professional development. So, for instance, here in Francis Marion University, every member of faculty, no matter your position or anything, once you're a member of faculty, you are eligible to access up to $3,000 within a year period for your professional development. So apart from expanding the resource base could actually be spread across evenly as well among the members of the organization or members of the group to actually control conflict. That's one way. Either expanding the resource base or making or having an even distribution of the resource base, so people do not feel that there's some form of inequity or unfairness in the distribution of those resources. Another way managers could actually control conflict would be to enhance coordination among departments that are interdependent, right? So they enhance coordination of interdependence among those departments whereby they have a working relationship. That way, their working relationship wouldn't actually be basis for conflict to arise, right? Another way managers could control conflict would be to ensure that they focus the employees' attention on superordinate goals or higher level goals. So when employees are, the expectations of employees are to achieve very, very, very high goals, there would be less cases of conflict because employees will be more challenged and more motivated towards attaining those goals rather than being in conflict situations, right? Another way they could control for conflict within an organization would be to match the personalities and work habits of employees, so that way there will be less cases of interpersonal conflict, right, in working relationships between members of an organization. Resolving conflict. conflict must be addressed if it is to serve constructive purposes and prevent destructive consequences. And you find out that managers often need to resolve and eliminate conflict, right? Meaning not letting the conflict get out of hand, eliminating it entirely so the conflict situation ceases to exist. And you find out that there are ways to resolve conflict within organizations, and common methods for resolving or maybe eliminating conflict would include to avoid the conflict entirely, right? Avoiding the conflict and hoping that it will go away. Conflict avoidance will be one way to actually resolve conflict when there are hopes that the conflict on its own will be resolved on its own by going away, right? Now, another way would be to convince the conflicting parties to reach a compromise, right? To have some form of middle ground, so such that the conflict situation is stemmed down, right? Also would be to bring the conflicting parties together to confront the conflict, right? Having them face whatever conflict situation or whatever the reasons that prompted for the conflict situation to arise in the first place, right? And that would require maturity on each side for them to confront the basis or whatever reasons that caused for conflict. And another way to resolve conflict would be what you call the alternative dispute resolution, right? Which would be maybe the manager to arbitrate, right? To come in as an arbitrator to actually mediate between the conflicting parties, right? Negotiation. This is the process in which two or more parties, right? The two or more parties may involve people or groups, right? They reach an agreement on an issue, even though they have different preferences regarding that issue. So they kind of reach a compromise. That would be some form of negotiation, right? When they reach a compromise, in as much as they have differing preferences, if that makes sense. And there are four primary approaches basically to negotiation, right? And those approaches are considerate of individual differences, right? Situational characteristics. They are also cognizant of the game theory and also the cognitive approaches to negotiation. Right. So looking at the approaches to negotiation from the individual differences, right? Let's look at the psychological. This concentrates on the personality traits of the negotiators, which is the individual differences of those people in a negotiating situation. You find out that for this particular approach, you find out that early psychological approaches, right, they assume that the key to successful negotiation was to select the right person to do the negotiating, right? One who had the appropriate demographic characteristics, maybe someone who has the appropriate age, is of the appropriate gender, race, and so forth, to be the one to engage in the negotiating situation, right? Or personality variables like someone who is able to take on more risks, someone who has maybe an internal locus of control that is not affected by the environment, or who is not whose outcomes are not determined by the external influences, right? Or someone who's authoritarian, right? However, the research on this approach showed that the positive results expected because of the variables in situation, right, that affect. So basically, it's basically saying that positive results expected because situational variables negated the effects of the individual differences, right? So how do I mean? It means that research shows that in as much as these individual traits, right, personality traits affected a negotiating situation, right, and it's expected that people who possess the relevant or requisite traits should be the ones that are called upon in a negotiating situation. There are situational variables that actually impede the expression of those individual traits to be very relevant towards the negotiation. And that's why there's another approach to negotiation, which is considerate of the situational characteristics, right, or the situational variable. And that arm to negotiation or approach to negotiation is basically looking at the context within which negotiation takes place, right? The situational characteristics basically include things like the types of communication between negotiators, right? The relative power of the negotiating parties, both their positional and personal power, right? And the presence of other parties in the negotiation. Those are situational characteristics. Let's say maybe the presence of a mediator in a negotiating situation, right? I don't know if that makes sense. However, many external or many situational characteristics are actually external to the negotiators and beyond their control. So you find out that based on that, we'll be looking at the other approach, which is the approach that is cognizant of the game theory, right? Used to predict outcomes of negotiation situations. Now, the game theory requires that every alternative and outcome be analyzed with their related probabilities and numerical outcomes reflecting the preferences of negotiating parties for each outcome, right? So, in addition, the order in which different parties can make choices and every possible move are predicted, along with associated preferences for outcomes. But this approach is not very applicable in a real negotiation situation because it requires the ability to describe all the possible options or alternatives and their outcomes for every chosen alternative, right, before the negotiation begins. So it is it's almost impossible to be very considerate of all the alternatives that can be applicable to a negotiating situation, and also to be knowledgeable on what the outcomes for each of those alternatives that are chosen, what outcomes they would influence in the negotiating situation, because the negotiation is between two parties. You never really know when you choose one alternative what the reaction from the other negotiator would be and how that would impact the eventual outcome. So it's not cast in stone what the outcomes will be. The prediction is never total, right? If that makes sense. So that's why it's not very feasible to actually take on this approach. And finally, we'll be looking at the final approach, which is the cognitive approach, which is looking at behavioral approaches, right? And in looking at the behavioral approaches, they are trying to make a prediction when the negotiators rather will depart from what you call perfect rationality, right? So the cognitive approach recognizes that negotiators basically would depart from perfect rationality rather during negotiation, right? So it looks at how to predict when these negotiators will make these departures,